One of the great things about working in my business is that I work on a lot of interesting projects with a lot of interesting clients. One of the recent projects I've worked on allowed us to create a custom payment system with Xero, Airtable, and Make.com. Let's have a look how that sort of system can be built. Let's get started. So at the heart of my solution, I'll be using Make.com. It used to be called Integromat. It's a very nice visual tool for creating complex automations, simple and complex automations. It's quite similar to Zapier in its output, in the sense that it's achieving multi-step automations, but it's much more visual and extremely powerful. And there are some things that you can do in Make that you cannot do in Zapier, and vice versa. So it's a great tool for this particular integration. One of the main reasons that I'm using Make here is that within Make, the Xero integration allows us to extract easily the URL of the invoice from Xero, which is not so easy to do in Zapier. So let's have a look at how to build this automation, starting with Airtable. So here we are in Make.com. We've just created a new scenario, and the first thing we'll see when we arrive in the scenario is this big black cross in the middle of on the side of the screen here, and this is where we're going to create our Airtable module, and then we're going to have that module listen to changes or new records in our Airtable base in the paid meetings table. So let's get started on this automation. So click on the plus sign here, and then I've already pre-selected the Airtable module, but you can search for the module here. So select Airtable, then click on Watch Records, and then we need to choose a connection. So we click Add, and we actually we've got a couple of different options. Airtable Auth has been a bit problematic. I find it hard to work with. I haven't actually successfully managed to get that working so far. So I'm going to use the Airtable token or key option. Now Airtable keys, the API keys, are only going to be useful for the next 10 months. This is now March 2023. So I'm going to use API keys for now, but in future you'll need to create a personal access token. So where do we get this API key from? Well, we'll need to go to the Airtable developers section of your account. So you go into Airtable, and then you'll find here on the side in developers, you'll find create, you'll find the API key option here. You'll see there's two options: use API instead, or create token. So what we're going to do in this case, we're going to use the API key. So I'm just going to select that API key, and API key has been generated for you already. So we'll just copy that key, and we're going to go and paste that key into Make.com, and then click Save. And shortly you'll have your connection to Airtable. Now we need to select the base. So in this case it's the business development base, and then we need to select the particular table within the base. So it's paid meetings. And so what we're going to be listening for is basically we're going to have a last modified field. And we don't have one in there at the moment. So let's go have a look at the paid meetings table, and we'll add a last modified or created time field in there. So what I'll do, I think because we're going to be making updates to it, so when you first enter the field, the question is, do you want to generate the payment when you first create it or when you make an update? So I'm going to suggest that we add a field here, a single select option, single select, and this field will be called OK to pay, OK to invoice, and it will have two options. One will be yes, and one will be no. So obviously when we select yes, it will then generate the invoice. So at the moment that's blank, and just put it as no if you want, or leave it as default. And then on the end here, we're going to add the last modified field. So we're going to go last modified time in here. and create that field there. So obviously when we make a change to this field here, OK to invoice, we'll then update the last modified, so that will trigger the automation there in make.com. So I'm going to go back into Make now. Obviously we have to resynchronize, and I'll just pick up those new fields. So we've got last modified in here. The label field, which is the initial one at the start here, the name of the person is the default label field. We're only interested in returning one record at a time, and the rest can be left as they are. And the view itself, sorry, is the grid view. Let's select the grid view, default view, and click. Just a moment here. Yeah, I think that's fine. And click OK. And then we'll choose where to start. So we're going to start from this time onwards. There's no records anyway from prior to today. So we're just going to go OK. So now we're watching for records. Now what we're going to do is just test to see if this works. So we'll just click run once. And what will happen is that you'll see there won't be any records. So that operation will have occurred, but there's nothing there. So that's basically nothing. That can't really give you any information at all at this point. So what we're going to do is add in a value. So I'm going to add in, so Fred Smith here, OK to invoice, and we'll select, yes, and then I'm going to kick off the automation again and see what we've got here. And here we have Fred Smith. So you can see by modifying that record, we've now triggered this particular module. So now we've got the module triggering whenever you make a change to, in Airtable, add in, modify the record, and we can then add the next module. Now what we want to do is we want to check to see if that specific related contact is already in Xero. If not, create the contact in Xero. So we're going to go and use the Xero module. And what we want to do is check to see if a contact already exists. We're going to have to search for contacts by name or email. In this case, I think we will use email. We can actually use a combination of the two, which I've used in the past. So we search for them via the name, and then we confirm whether it's the same person or not. So in Xero, there shouldn't be duplicate names. You should have more than, each name should be unique. So we can then search for a contact, and we're going to select add connection, my Xero connection. Now we're going to select the scope here, which is going to be accounting. I think we actually are pretty good with the defaults. I think we should be okay. Well, we can always adjust that later on. And I'll try these ones. I think that's the one. Click save. And then you have to log into Xero. Now in this particular case, I've already set up the connection to the demo company. So I'm just going to select continue with one organization. It's a little bit confusing, but it does connect us directly to the organization that we're already logged into in the other tab here. You can see I'm logged into demo company. So continue with one organization. That then redirects us back to Xero. Sorry, to make.com. And now this particular, what we're doing is we're searching for a contact. So we're searching by a particular field. In this case, the field is the email address. In fact, yep, we'll just search by the email address. We can also search by name. I think that's probably the wise thing to do. So we're going to search by email address, that the email address equals the same email address that we received from the first step. So let's just grab that from the first step. And the name is also I'm going to use contains because that's actually case insensitive. So we can do that, name contains, and then we can go for take the full name as well. So let's see if that works. We can always fine tune it if we need to. So click OK. Now we're watching the records, search for contacts. What we need to do in here is add a filter. So we don't obviously want to search for contacts and do all the rest, creating invoices, etc., unless we've actually said that we should create an invoice. So we could do that. So we just select here, set up a filter, and the filter will be OK to invoice. And in this case, the condition is that OK to invoice is yes. So if OK to invoice is yes, then we go ahead and do all the rest, search for a contact. If we have found a contact, then we don't need to create it again. But if we haven't found a contact, then we do need to create it. So what I'm going to do is add another Xero module here. Actually, I'm going to add what's called a router, which will allow us to decide if we've got a contact, then we'll create it. We won't create it. If we don't have a contact, we will create it. So what I'll do here, I'll just go to router. So actually do that one here, right click. Just grab a router from there, pop that in there. And then I'm going to, from the router, I'm going to add some more modules. We've got 2 modules. One of them is going to be the Xero module for creating a contact, and the other one is going to be the data store module. Actually, so no, the other one is I'm going to go directly to create the invoice. So what I do is I go set up the filter if contact exists. So the contact exists here. And then I'll just say contact ID exists. So contact exists. Now what do we do if the contact exists? We can send them an invoice. So that's where we do 0. And we're going to create an invoice from scratch. So create an invoice. And we're going to select the account, Xero connection, continue. We need to add extended permissions. So go back in again. So we've extended permissions here, and select the organization, demo company. The type here is a sales invoice, and the contact ID is the contact ID back here, which is on the search step. So just bring that one across, and then we can add our line items. So in this particular case, I'm just going to add a very simple line item, which is going to be meeting fee. And the quantity will be 1. The unit amount. Now we're going to get the unit amount directly from the table, from Airtable. So we need to go back and have a look just down here. The first record here, the fee is here, 50. So that's there. And the item and the account code, we can leave that there. Tax code, we could say, for example, BAS excluded. Account code, it would be sales, sorry. That's going to go into our sales account. Tax amount, we can say 0. We're not going to charge tax on this one. I think there. Okay. And that's all good. And that should be it. So, and then we click OK. So that should now generate, if you've got an existing contact, should then generate an invoice. Now I know that this contact already exists in the database, so we should be fine. Now what I'm going to do here is I'm going to set up a filter that the contact does not exist. So if the contact does not exist, we will then create a contact in Xero. So contact does not exist. So, okay. And then what we're going to do is create the contact in Xero. Again, select the demo organization. And the name of the contact is exactly the name that came across in Airtable, which is Fred Smith. We can show some more advanced settings here. Now, what we would probably need to do, we'll just bring out his full name. Now, in our Airtable record, we should have a formula in there for splitting first name and last name. So we're not going to put that in right now. The email here, Peter at Process Culture, in that one. And the rest of it we can just leave it as it is. So you're going to get a very basic contact record just with the name and the email. And then of course, now it's not possible here to just bring that right back into the other one, so we're going to have to create a new invoice again, so kind of duplicate it. What we can do to speed up the process is actually take the existing module that we've set up, right click on it, and we can actually clone the module to make like a direct copy of it, or clone of it, sorry. And then we'll have to go in there and configure it, because in case any values have come from a previous step, but I think we're actually pretty safe. Oh, hang on. So so the contact ID does not come from step number 4, because there was no contact, if you remember. It actually comes from step number 6. So that's where we take the contact ID from step number 6. And again, everything else is pretty well the same. And just click OK. Now, at the end of this process, what we want to do is indicate that an invoice has been issued to this client. So let's go back to Airtable. And in Airtable, we need to create, firstly, we need to probably select no, because you've already invoiced them. But we could actually, make it a little bit more interesting if I just go in here where it says OK to invoice. We'll add another option, and this one will be invoiced. And we can just mark it as, give it a color of reddish or pinky color. Click Save. And now what we do is we go back into make.com, and then after you've created the invoice, we can actually go back into Airtable and just update that value. So go into Airtable, update a record, and we're going to pick the record that from the first step there. So we go back into business development, select the paid meetings table, and then the record ID comes from the very first step. So we'll just go and grab that very first step, which is this record ID here. So that's the record ID that we updated. And then we're going to select, for OK to invoice, we'll just put in invoiced. So you have to type it in, physically type it in, the value there, and then click OK. And then using the little trick that we used before, clone that one, and then pull that across, connect that to this particular step. And pretty well, I don't think you need to change anything, because it's going to be retrieving values from before the route and before the split. So yeah, it is a little bit annoying that you have to sort of, obviously repeat the same thing again, but you can see here we have our basic automation set up. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to run this through. Now, you obviously you can select scheduling, and that will then run automatically all the time, and that's the way to do it in the long term. Once you've developed the solution, you can then run it and keep running it. Whenever there's a change, you will then get the invoice generated, and you'll then get the updates into Airtable. But for now, we're just going to do a trial run. So I'm going to go into Airtable. I'm going to just flick this off for a second. Now, we're just going to prove that when it says no to invoice, it will block it. So let's go and test that. So we'll just go into, hang on, there you go, just go into here, select run once, and it should stop at the filter, which is exactly what it's done. So you can see if we click on the filter, it says OK to invoice is not yes. if that's what it means there. So the condition has not been met. So now we go back in there again, and this time we'll select yes, and then we'll actually click on the run once button, and it should run right the way through. Because the contact doesn't exist, and you see that's a beautiful thing about make.com, you get a visual representation as you go through the system here. And we can see that the search for contacts returned, there was no, so number of bundles 0, there was no result there. So when we got there, got to the router, and the filter was a contact does not exist. We then create the contact, create the invoice, and then update the record in Airtable. So if we go back into Airtable right now, we can see it's marked as invoice. So it has worked successfully. Now there's one other little piece that would be really useful. If the customer comes back to us and if they want us to send them an invoice, or we can create a step where we'll actually email out the invoice, it would be nice to have the invoice URL. So I'll add another field here called invoice URL, and this will actually be a URL type in Airtable. So create the field there. I'll just push that along to there, next to the drop down. And then if we go back into make.com, after we've actually created the invoice, I'm just going to go and add in here another module, which is to download the invoice, get the invoice URL. So select here, get invoice URL, and then your organization, and then the invoice ID, which comes from the previous step. So step number 8, invoice ID is here. We select that and click OK. And again, we could duplicate that step or clone it, but it's pretty easy. So we just go add a module, 0, get invoice URL, and then select the invoice ID from the previous step, and then click OK. And then the last piece is to update the record. Now we've got the invoice URL, so what we'll do is, as well as updating the value to invoice, we can also pass on the invoice URL, which is here. Okay, and we'll do it down here as well in this lower branch. And select the invoice URL and click OK. So now when we run it, we should get the actual 0 invoice URL. So let's try that one more time. Again, we'll flick that to no, and just go and have a little look down here, and just run it again, and it will stop again at the filter. So that's stopped at the filter. Then we'll go back in here and select yes. As soon as we've done that, then we can run it manually again, and you'll see this time it will run right through and generate the invoice URL and update a record. You notice how it went through the lower branch because we'd already created that contact in 0. So if we go back into Airtable, you'll see it's invoice, but you've also got an invoice URL. So we can click on this invoice URL and open up the invoice, and you can see what we've created. So as you can see, we had an error there, which is was a bit unexpected, but actually once I've dug a little bit, it's fairly obvious. Firstly, there's a couple of things I missed out, so let's go back through and fix them. So firstly, in here, we've actually not specified the due date for the invoice, and also another thing, you can't get the invoice URL unless the invoice is actually approved. So let's go in here and click on create an invoice, and at the bottom here you'll see this toggle here, show advanced settings, and in advanced settings we can actually go down and select the status as authorized. There's a number of statuses: draft, submitted, and authorized. So select it as authorized. Then there's one other thing that we need to do. We need to set the actual the due date for the invoice, because if you don't do that, you can't create the invoice. So you can't create an approved invoice, authorized. So what we do is we're going to use one of these date functions in here. So we're going to use the add days date function. So add days, and then what you do is just click in between the two parentheses, and then use now, which is basically today's date, and then add however many days is the default for you. So now we can, of course, in more complex systems retrieve that information from somewhere else, but I'm going to put in that this invoice is due in 7 days time, or it could be in 1 day time, whatever. If you're just about to book, could be that day. So we could just say 0 or 1. Let's put 7 for the example in any case, and then click OK. And then we'll do the same below here, and I've actually done this already. So if we go, create an invoice, scroll down here, you can see add days 7, and then status authorized. So now when we run that, hopefully this time you'll get a valid invoice URL. So we'll go back into the business development base and make that change. So let's go into the development base and just switch that on to no. I'll just run it for a second here and stop it at the filter. And then go back into here again and select yes for OK to invoice, and then run it again. This time should run right the way through with no errors, fingers crossed. And there you go, it's gone right through and updated the record in Airtable, and you can see here it says invoiced, invoice URL, and we just click on that link, and with good luck we've got, there you go, we've got an invoice. So 50 Australian dollars, no GST, quantity of 1, and meeting fee. So we've successfully created an invoice in Xero directly from Airtable. So that's fairly successful. If you've got any questions about this integration, add a comment below. All right, thanks very much.